Thank you, Annalisa. And thank you, David. And at the back, thank you, Peter, Ryan, and Jody for being here. And always thank you to Leanne and Kelly. Today is a very interesting day in the life of the church, and that lesson that we heard from the early church is just a perfect one because it's about church meetings and how even in that context, change is possible as the Spirit of God moves organizations to new ways of being. And that great translation by Peterson includes the comments at the end, everybody went silent as they heard the testimony of what was being done in spite of what was the result when they used to do it, the way it used to be back in the day. We've all been there in the churches, and we are going to hear today from a taped sermon, reflection, I guess it would be better to call it, from the Right Reverend Gary Patterson. Dr. Patterson is in early retirement from Vancouver. His partner, the Reverend Tim Stevenson, was in fact the first self-declared practicing homosexual person ordained in the United Church of Canada. But Gary was the first moderator, and that's why we had that reading today about the power of church meetings to have change. And so in a kind of a funny way, 2,000 years later, we had another circumstance of people standing up and testifying what they had seen and having that testimonial be listened to and its impact felt. And so it's a real pleasure that the church at the Pacific Mountain region said to us we were allowed to share this time that Gary had given us about 4 weeks ago in one of our town hall meetings. Thank you.
But it is good to be here, and so let me just launch in and take you back just 3 or 4 or 5 years, Trump times, which we're trying to forget. But there was a classic, absolutely United Church sign outside of the church on their big bulletin board that said, and I've added, I think that they wanted, but were a little bit too careful. But Jesus said, do not build a taller wall, just build a longer table. And that felt like classic United Church theology and affirmation in the midst of what was then a refugee crisis, but points to the larger meaning of the term affirmation. Which brings me to the song by Shirley Arena Murray, one of my favorite hymn writers. She's passed away, from New Zealand. But if you're looking for a collection of interesting language, she's the person that wrote God Weeps in More Voices, or God of the Gospel, God of the Bible, number 28, a congregational favorite of ours. But she writes, for everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread. A shelter, a space, a safe place for growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. For trans woman man, there's a place at the table, revising the roles, deciding to share with wisdom and grace, sharing the power for trans and woman, a system that's fair. For young and for old, a place at the table, a voice to be heard as part of the song, the hands of a child in hands that are wrinkled. For young and for old, the right to belong. For gay and for straight, for LGBTQ2S and straight, there's a place at the table, a covenant shared, a welcoming space. Now get this image, it's quite beautiful. A rainbow of race and color and gender. For LGBTQ and straight, a chalice of grace. For everyone born, a place at the table, to live without fear and simply to be, to work, to speak out, to witness, to worship. For everyone born, the right to be free. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. It's one of the very few hymns that I have come across that are, mainstream, that actually include the LGBT community. And I must confess it's added at the bottom as an additional verse to be used when needed. And you'll find some versions of the hymn that don't actually include that verse, which says a lot about our church history. But that's why we're here. I'm a gay person, and this is a discussion on affirming ministries, which always begin with the place and the welcome and the celebration of the LGBTQIA2S community. We keep adding more and more to that. It's not in a hymn book. You'd have to Google it, and it's online, and then I think it may be covered by licensing. I'm not certain, but surely Arena Murray has lots of connections with us in Canada, and it's worth tracking down. It really is. But I start with the gay and lesbian and bi and trans community, but recognize that the affirming process needs to include everybody. And did you know that Lois Wilson was our first woman to be moderator in 1980? And I had the delight of phoning her on International Women's Day to talk about the work she's now engaged in, which is fighting with many others across the church for the guaranteed livable income. She turned 94 a couple of weeks ago, and I emailed her and got a little mushy, and she said, "Enough, Gary, there is work for us to do." And I think, yes, we are a denomination ordained in 36, first a woman in 1980. Marion was the second lay woman to be chosen as our moderator after Ann Squires in the 80s, so that we have wrestled with the inclusion and the affirmation of women. In 2012, we declared ourselves to be, at best or hopefully, an intercultural church, recognizing not just multicultural, but that we will be changed by our connections with each other. In 2015, we accepted the theology report on disabilities and said there's got to be a place at the table for people who are disabled in one way or another. And then at the end of 2018, when we had so many people of color and indigenous people and black people, the BIPOC community come forward and say, we experience so much racism in the United Church, and you white people with so much privilege are often blind. And so we've committed ourselves to do our best to become an anti-racist church. So this is affirmation and affirming ministries, LGBT focused, but much broader, and the learnings can be transferred from one community to another, that we seek to, in fact, be a rainbow of race and color and gender and orientation and ability, disability, you name it. And that's the dream, I think, of the kingdom of God. I share all of this because I want to point out how important the affirming process is. We've made amazing strides in Canada, incredible changes that were unbelievable to me back in the 60s or the 70s or even in the 80s. But nevertheless, there's still a lot of work to be done. We find ourselves working on issues of trans rights, transgender rights, gender identity. Did you know that LGBTQ teenagers are 3 times more likely to try and commit suicide than their straight equivalents? You don't know how much bullying goes on, all the way from, oh, that's so gay, to the cruder epithets of faggot, homo, queer. I have a granddaughter who's wrestling with her identity, and it is not easy. So I'm saying, you think affirming isn't necessary. It actually is, particularly in smaller communities or remote communities. And we need to keep doing this work, and we need to be aware of the hidden pain and the insecurities that teens and young people still actually have to live with. I remember Tim and I in the late 80s, before 88, being at an event at Naramata Center where we were talking about sexuality. And one person said, but what about the kids? And the first response was to separate pedophilia from homosexuality, which was still a common confusion, inappropriate, wrong, but there. And then Tim said, well, actually, let me tell you, we're doing this for the kids. We invite you to look at your Sunday school and your youth groups and recognize that 5 to 10% of them are LGBT. And what are you doing for them? They need role models. They need to be reassured they're okay, that they are God's beloved children. And so I realized how important it is to lift up those those words of P for public, I for intentional, and E for, it's just gone. Intentional.
Explicit.
Thank you, explicit. I have it even written down, but pi. We actually need that for people who are wandering, who are lost, who need that reassurance. The United Church is in a unique spot to be a home for many former Catholics or folk who come from evangelical traditions, where their sexuality is condemned, where they are often ostracized or shunned.
We got Gary off in the middle of that sentence, but what he was about to say is so important for us, which is that as we work fully to become an affirming congregation, we think it's for us and for the people that call First Met home, but actually so many people, like the story that Adina shared with the children, who don't even know what the United Church of Canada might mean yet. For those people as well, we work, and as Tim said, we work for the children, and so we are grateful to the moderator's testimony and his sharing, and his reminder of all the milestones that we've already achieved, which strengthen us to hear and see the impact that we can yet have. And again, we thank Gary for his time with us.